to the BBC's Radio Theatre for a special edition of Hard Talk. My guest today is known around the world for his film, television and theatre work. He made his name for his uncanny ability to portray other well-known people. Tony Blair, Brian Clough, David Frost. Roles that catapulted Michael Sheen into a life far from his home in Port Talbot in South Wales. But it was acting that also brought him back there, where he's now immersed in tackling some of the problems that face a poor community: poverty, debt and homelessness. So how does he straddle such contrasting worlds? Michael Sheen, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you very much.
So how does the Hollywood star fit in on Port Talbot's High Street?
Yeah, it's an interesting double life, and inevitably there's a bit of that happens anyway. You know, when you start to feel like, oh, this is my hometown, but I sort of feel like my sense of belonging is split now, and that just kept extending. So at first it was having moved down to London to come to drama school here, and then starting to work as an actor, and then eventually that leading me to go and live in America for a while, and then I suppose, and then having some fame and celebrity, that inevitably also can be a separating thing as well, regardless of the geographical space you inhabit, and then to the point where I am now, where yeah, it feels very much like straddling two worlds, where I suppose I'm essentially trying to have two full-time careers, and that is quite challenging.
Currently, you've just, I think, finished a couple of American series, which, you know, just put your name and you'll see Good Omens, The Good Fight. They are travelling very far and fast with...
I only do projects with the word good in them now. It's just a contractual thing. Yeah.
But it is, but what your breakthrough role, as I sort of mentioned, was Tony Blair, which was back in The Deal, and that was a breakthrough here, which was The Deal, 2003, focusing on the Blair-Brown relationship and a deal they struck over the leadership. And yet I was absolutely gobsmacked to see you say, particularly given your subsequent roles, I can't do impersonations.
No, I've never been... You know, I think people assume that I was the kid at school who did impersonations of the teachers, and I was never any good at it. In fact, it was sort of a joke that I was terrible at that kind of thing.
But you wouldn't say that now?
Well, I sort of slightly balk when the word impersonation comes up, because that's not really in any way what I'm trying to do. In a way, it's the opposite. I don't want people to be worried about the surface, although that is part of the challenge, and that's why I think I partly like playing those sort of roles, because you inevitably, if you walk onto a stage or in front of a camera and you say, I'm playing David Frost or whoever, you know, someone that you know the audience is very familiar with, you can't shirk that. You have to somehow meet that, because that's the expectation. But the work, I think, is always to try and make sure that very, very quickly the audience is comfortable with you, accepts that you're playing that person that they're very familiar with, and then just lets go of that and goes on the journey with you.
And you enjoy the fear of that a bit, don't you?
I enjoy the challenge of that. The fear or the challenge of playing someone very familiar is quite different for a camera than it is on stage. So when I was playing Frost on stage, just walking out from behind the wings and coming in front of a live audience and saying, hello, good evening and welcome, or whatever, was like, I realized that I sort of realized I'm a theatre animal in that sense. I like being in the room with you and being able to kind of smell you and then to dominate you. That's what I like. Whereas on camera, you can't do it. It's very different. They're just out there somewhere, and it's a very different beast. So, but I've only done it once on stage, you know, which is Frost. OK, and, I mean, you haven't done theatre in a while, so it's quite interesting, no. this sort of environment, I suppose. Yes, I'm very aware of you. I want to get in amongst you.
Tony Blair.
Yes.
Did you ever meet him afterwards? Did he ever comment on what you made of him?
Yes, well, so I played him 3 times. There was The Deal, the one that you mentioned, which was actually the first time I ever played a real person in that sense. Although I'd played Mozart before, but no one really knows what he sounds like, you know, so you can kind of get away with that. But so that was the first time I ever played a real person, and that was, I mean, it was terrifying.
What did he say about it, though?
I was at a dinner or something in New York, and at the time, Wendy Murdoch was there, and she came up to me and said, "I'm having a dinner for Tony soon. Would you like to come?" And I thought, well, I've played him twice now. You know, it'd be interesting to see how he moves through a room and that kind of stuff. So I thought, yeah, all right. And then, of course, I realized, hang on, that means, where is this dinner? Oh, it's at our place in LA. So I ended up going to Rupert Murdoch's house, which was on the top, still is, presumably, on the top of one of the Hollywood hills. Just this, it was like a Bond villain's lair. I mean, it really was. It was just up on the top of a hill, looking out across all of LA. And I get there, and I get out of the car, and there are, you know, people, snipers up on the roof and stuff. And it was like walking onto the Death Star. And I go in, and Wendy comes out and immediately ushers me straight through out to this sort of area where people were kind of milling around. And suddenly I'm standing in front of Tony Blair, and she's saying, Tony, look, it's you. And the two of us are just standing there, kind of looking at each other, not quite knowing what to do. And then people said, so Tony, what do you think of Michael's performances? And he said, I've never seen him, never seen him.
Seriously?
Yeah, and then people went away, and then he talked to me in detail about scenes within each of the things. So, you know.
Okay. Now, the second time you played him was in The Queen, which is, of course, The Queen played by Helen Mirren. And you have been refreshingly honest, because this was sort of your breakthrough international role, about the reaction to her and the rather more subdued reaction to you.
Well, so I sort of started, I'd say to Peter Morgan, who wrote it, I said, look, you keep writing these things that's about two people, and the other one's always more interesting. Why do I always play the boring one? And I've always thought, well, certainly at that time, the things that he was writing about often were about, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but it's sort of the monster at the heart of the labyrinth, and then there's the hero who goes looking for it, you know, and the audience find their way through with the hero, but it's the monster that's interesting. It's the monster that's fascinating, and in The Queen, the monster is the Queen. In Frost Nixon, the monster is Nixon. You know, and that's just the way it was.
Now, across all your roles, millions of people will have seen you, but it was something that presumably only a few thousand people saw, that you described as undoubtedly the most significant thing in my career, but also the most significant thing in my life, probably. And this was, of all things, it's quite hard to explain, but it was the Passion Play in Port Albert.
Yes. It's interesting because not even quite sure what it's called. That gives a sense of the extraordinariness of the event. So for anyone who doesn't know, in 2011, I created and was part creator of a production, theatrical production, I guess, in my hometown of Port Talbot for the National Theatre Wales. It took about 2.5 years to develop, and ultimately it was a single performance, a live performance that lasted non-stop for 72 hours, that took place all over the town. And it was about the town, and it was I worked with about 2,000 local people on it, ultimately. And it took place over the Easter weekend. And it was, so the template for the production, it was a story based on the events of the Passion of Christ. But it was a modern day story, and it was telling ultimately a story about that town now.
So you, the Jesus type figure, no, you don't.
He was called the teacher.
I know,
yes.
you balk at being
He was a local comprehensive school teacher who disappeared.
You were crucified at the end of it.
He was ultimately killed on the roundabout in Port Talbot, yes. Yes. And when we began, yes, so the first official episode then, because we sort of did it in what I called episodes, and the first official episode didn't happen until, I believe it was like 2 o'clock on Good Friday afternoon. But I spread rumours that if you were to come to the beach when the sun rose, you might see something. So there were maybe 100 or so people there at that.
But we should explain, by the end,
depending on who you ask, there was anywhere between 10 to 15,000 people.
And we're talking about a town that is a population of 40,000.
Yes. So my character, the point of my character was that he arrived He was someone from the local community who had disappeared. He had some sort of breakdown. And then on the morning of Good Friday, he appears down at by the sea, and with no memory. He's lost his memory. And over the weekend, he asks people to tell him stories about the town and what's been lost and what's been there and what people have memories of, and he starts to become a receptacle of all this stuff. And then when he's finally on the cross, he remembers everything, and he starts listing a sort of a litany of things in the actual town that have disappeared.
And that motivation for you was an inspiration that came, I think, when you were in the Vatican, because you thought what is happening now in Port Albert is what was happening then.
I was on holiday in Italy, and I went to Rome. I'd never been to Rome before, and I was very excited to go to Rome. And I went to, you know, the St. Peter's Basilica, and I was quite overwhelmed by it. For anyone who's been there, it's quite overwhelming being in there. And I thought, I just need to have a little sit down for a minute. And I saw off in the corner just a little area that had some chairs, and there was no one there. So I went to sit down. There was a sort of light on it. And I sat in this, and it turns out to be St. Joseph's Chapel. And I sat there, and there were paintings on the wall around me depicting Jesus's ministry. So all the things he did, and, you know, he's tending to the sick and with children and the dying and the grieving and all that kind of stuff. And as I sat there, I thought, that is exactly what people are doing in Port Talbot right now. There are organizations and charities and support groups and, you know, carers and teachers and nurses and hospices and all these things and I was like, oh, that's what Jesus did, and that is what community is. That is how we keep community going. And in that moment it clicked for me. I was like, I'm telling the story of Jesus, but it's not the story of Jesus, it's the story of the community that are doing that, and that Port Talbot was the kind of marginalized. The motorway goes through it. No one stops in Port Talbot. It's seen as being dirty because of the industry, and so it would be, if it was a person, it would be a person that Jesus would have, you know, been dealt with.
But the interesting thing is, for you who insist you're not religious, you do this play, and then you yourself, for example, take on the moneylenders in Wales.
Yeah.
And you've set up this End High Cost Credit Alliance.
Yes. Well, I suppose what happened, so the Passion happened in 2011, and as a result of that, and me becoming more connected to these different groups and organizations in the town, and having a sense of what it is that keeps communities alive in very challenging circumstances, I wanted to stay connected, obviously, and they wanted me to, you know, talk about them, have a photograph, you know, because the other experience I had over the 2.5 years or whatever it was of developing it, I would come into the town and then go away and come back and go away. And each time I came back, I would notice that something had gone, something had disappeared, that some service had been cut, or so I was very aware of the challenges that were there, and how support was being taken away, actively taken away, because of council budgets being cut and all that kind of stuff. So my awareness of the importance of what people were doing there was very connected to a sort of bigger picture, more political, with a capital P, I suppose, sense of what the context of that was. And I started to not only want to become more involved with the groups, but also started wanting to try and see if I could do something in terms of the big picture as well. And so that eventually led to me getting to the point where I was like, I don't want to just have a picture taken. I don't want to just, you know, have my face in the paper or have my name as the patron. I want to do more than that. I was getting to a point in my career as well, you know, since 2011, over the next sort of 5-6 years or whatever, where, you know, work was very good for me. I had a lot of choice. I didn't have to audition for things anymore. I could sort of work whenever I wanted to, which meant that I had a fairly steady supply of financial resources. I had a media resource. You know, I could come and talk about things and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, right, either I have to take a step back now because it's too much, or I have to take a step forward, and I just have to change things. And the circumstances of my life were such that my daughter was about to leave home. I'd lived in America because she had grown up there, and I wanted to be with her. And so she was leaving, and all the planets just aligned to go, you can go and spend more time in Britain now and really do this. And that's
Did you get pushback? Did you get pushback from people, perhaps still, who say, look, what do you know? you know, you've got this Hollywood life.
Yeah.
Seriously, what difference can you make?
Yeah, and that's a very good thing to say. I think anyone who gets involved in the sort of things I've got involved in people need to be suspicious of me. People need to not trust that what you say is going to happen. I mean, you know, why just because you have some celebrity doesn't mean that you get a free pass at anything. This is important things. People rely on this stuff. People, you know, are dependent on the kind of support groups and the work that people are doing. You can't mess around with that. And so I think it's important that people are like, really? And what I've realized, of course, is that one of the most important resources I can give, one of the most valuable things I can give is time, so that you're not just turning up, doing something and you know, running off, that your commitment is long-term and that you really commit to really trying to, as much as you can, understand these issues, because they're incredibly complicated. You know, it's not just sound bites, it's not just going on Twitter and writing something ranty. These are really complex issues.
Well, let's look at one of the things you're doing, which you led the bid to get the Homeless Football World Cup in Cardiff, which is coming up next month.
Yep.
And it is a strange idea, homeless football.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to imagine even how you get a team together.
Yeah.
Because you've got 500 people, 50 countries.
There are over 500 players coming to represent their countries, and they're coming from over 50 different countries. Yes.
But so how does it work then?
Yeah. So
what's the point?
It started for me with an organisation called Street Football Wales, which is a sort of grassroots organisation, and they're the people who create the Welsh teams for the Homeless World Cup each year. And they got in touch with me and said, look, we use football as a way to kind of break down boundaries around homelessness and social exclusion. And we create tournaments and leagues and teams. Do you want to come and get involved? And my reaction was exactly the same. Why are you putting money and energy into doing football for homeless people? Why don't just deal with the homelessness? And then I realized the brilliance of how it works, which is that, of course, the football is the hook. That's what brings people in. That's what gets people to people who feel like they've been on the outside for so long, feel very alienated, might have all kinds of difficulties around socializing and having access to services and that kind of stuff. Suddenly people are coming, they get a bit of self-confidence, they feel part of a team. Suddenly they're a bit more motivated, health and well-being starts to pick up a little bit. And then if you take that to the next stage, which is you get to represent your country. You know, I went to the first Homeless World Cup I went to was in Oslo in Norway a few years ago. And there are people there who at that point were struggling with addictions, maybe to do with heroin or alcohol, you know, struggling with that at that time. And I remember watching someone score a goal for the first time. They'd never scored a goal. There was a woman called Dee. She doesn't mind me saying her name. She scored a goal for the first time, and I had just been sitting with her and hearing her talk about how she hadn't seen her children for so long and how she was having a tough time that day with stuff. And I watched her score a goal.
So
I'm very tired at the moment. I saw how transformational that can be. Not just scoring a goal, but being a part of that event. And I saw how it affected her after that.
I've got to ask you, you go from that, which obviously has a profound effect on you, and then you are filming.
Yeah.
Is that hard?
It's not hard. It's so for instance, you mentioned Good Omens, which is a TV series that is out at the moment that I was in, and we shot a lot of that in Oxfordshire. And at the time, I would be travelling from where we were filming in Oxfordshire back to Port Talbot the same day, because part of my contract, part of what I now do is make sure that if I'm filming on something for a long time, I have enough time within it to come back and forth and be able to do the things that I need to do around the other work. And so I would be traveling from Oxfordshire to Port Talbot. And I would be going from the most beautiful postcard kind of villages with gorgeous amenities and really lovely communities there with all kinds of wonderful things. And then going back through the M4 corridor, through the South Wales valleys, and where there was very much not that being the case. And that kind of makes you feel like, yeah, this is not a level playing field. This is not, it's nothing against the people in those, but it just makes you, it reminds you that there is, the context that this takes place in is not random. It's not by chance.
And we're talking about a time when the area you were in, which was very strong Labour supporting, in the most recent European elections, the Brexit Party topped the poll with 32% from nowhere.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of contradictions. Think about the miners' strike happening around 84, 85, and that a lot of the people in the areas that were fighting during the miners' strike to hold on to their work, and the people they were fighting against, you could say that they ended up voting in lockstep around Brexit. And that is just fascinating. That is very interesting. Why might that happen? And so I was sort of interested in that.
Okay, but you're not accepting that it is wanting out of the EU because of what the EU stands for?
I think it's a lot of things. I think some people absolutely were voting because they just don't like the idea of what being part of the European Union is to them. And I think everyone has a very personal thing about it. I think there definitely is, because I've seen it and I've spoken to people, there is a huge amount of anger and resentment in a lot of communities about what has been lost and what was not replaced. And a lot of blame for that goes into all kinds of areas. And it is very interesting to look into that. My biggest motivating factor around the effects of Brexit, or the aftermath of the Brexit vote, what I have held on to was that in that first period afterwards, it was a huge shock for the country, I think, in terms of its self-image, and particularly in the sort of metropolitan centres and within the media. And there was a sense of, oh my goodness, that our country is not what we thought it was, and we now have to open up to what's going on in communities that we don't often go and look into, we don't report from. There was a real effort to kind of open that window. And I've watched as that has closed. I've watched as in that shock, I think part of me was feeling like, well, there is a very positive aspect to this, which is that maybe the plight of these communities...
And you don't think that's any longer the case?
I think that slowly started to change into who's on this side, who's on that side, and the media as well started to kind of go, oh no, we're in control of this again. No, we know what this story is. We don't, and that has been quite a scary thing, that the actual issues have not changed.
Well, because you've talked about coming back to see if you can, trying to do something about the frustrations and the anger that's there.
Well, that's what I mean.
Do you think you can then?
Well, that's what my starting point was to go and listen to people. Go and ask people, what are the things that frustrate you the most? What are the things that you're finding difficult? And of course, even that conversation is difficult. How do you mediate that conversation as someone who is, coming from, has the life I have and is doing the things I do? That already it's like quantum physics. Already just your act of observation affects what you discover.
Everything that you're saying leads to the obvious question, which is whether and why wouldn't you stand as a politician?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for why that is not a good idea for me, and one of them is.
Do you rule it out?
Well, no, I don't rule it out. I don't rule it out because I don't rule anything out. What is the most effective use of what I can do can change from any moment to moment. And at the moment, I do not believe that that is the most effective use of what I can do. At the moment, politicians are one of the strings, one of the levers to pull. They're just one of them. I don't want to suddenly just become one of those levers. I want to be able to pull as many levers as I can. My biggest strength is I don't work for anybody. No one's paying. I'm not getting wages from someone that I have to be answerable to in this, in that respect. I can say whatever I want. And why would I suddenly find myself in a position where I have to go, what does the leader want me to say? I don't want to do that.
Thank you for coming.